So, the topic that I chose to speak on is on India's pharma biotech ecosystem and what lessons we have for the Australia India FTA and beyond. Because India is simultaneously negotiating or is in the process of negotiating with the European Union and with the UK. So, I think in that context, it will be important to discuss one of the most contested and hotly challenged, kind of debates on the pharma biotech ecosystem and what FTAs can do about it. So let's get a little background. So, in the context of global pandemic and where India has proposed, along with South Africa, the waiver of certain IP obligations as far as COVID-19 is concerned, in that context, where TRIPS and provisions in relation to IP protection in the TRIPS agreement, specifically for pharmaceuticals and Pharma-Biotech, seems to be, or at least there is an attempt to pull them back. What is the real hope for a TRIPS plus FTA, right? But there is a background to this. All is not lost. So, there is a background of negotiations in 2008 to 10, where you had IP issues. There was a joint feasibility study being done, and in that study, IP issues figured, including the TRIPS CBD and GIs beyond food, and the joint feasibility study in relation to Australia FTA, Australia India FTA, was set the ball rolling. There were some sticky points due to balance of trade concerns, and also primarily in there were Australia and India were at loggerheads on the agricultural subsidies issue and services. And thus, since 2015, the negotiation stopped. There was a report by the Australian government on the economic strategy for India, and in that report, they basically note, several instances where some of the IP-related concerns might be important. But as you can see, during RCEP, where India has decided not to be a party to, Australia and India had both converging and diverging approaches, and I'm going to do a little bit more about it towards the later slides. But in this context and in this background, will there be a clean state for Australia-India negotiations, in 2021 and 2022? So, what are Australia's and India's offensive and defensive interest in the pharma biotech space? More than Australia's offensive interest in pharma biotech, India has a lot of defensive interest in the pharma biotech space, primarily because it has been a generic powerhouse for medicines, and increasingly, in the agri-biotech space, etc., there are certain concerns that India has, and hence the IP interest involving both these sectors is largely defensive. And India is also concerned about MFNizing intellectual property. Primarily, strengthening IP for Australia would mean that similar protection will have to be extended to all WTO members. So, what is so peculiar about India's pharma IP ecosystem? I think there have been a lot of studies, a lot of literature around, uh, particularly talking about subject matter exclusions like Section 3D and also medical methods. And in that context, there seems to be some amount of exclusion of certain kind of pharmaceutical subject matter that many other countries usually grant, but Indian subject matter exclusion provisions are a bit more controversial in the sense that they use the criteria of therapeutic efficacy to weed out certain patents due to concerns of evergreening. Then there are questions of delay in grants due to repetitive patent oppositions. That is one issue. There are also concerns with reference to how limited exceptions are being interpreted by the courts, and also how the statutory regime structures those limited exceptions, primarily with reference to the three-step test in Article 30 of the TRIPS agreement, and also India's exhaustion regime, which where there is literature to show that it is a bit open-ended, and in that sense, patent exhaustion, whether it means international or national, is still quite debatable. Furthermore, there are certain changes that have been made to Form 27 working requirements in India, where uh, working can be a ground for compulsory license. And in relation to that, the requirement on the patent holder to disclose certain confidential information in relation to working has proved controversial. Although there are recent reforms to Form 27, many scholars and practitioners believe that those reforms are not fully in relation to how actually pharma practice works. Then there is also a question of revocation of patents in public interest, because the way the Section 66 of the Indian Patents Act is structured, it allows broader grounds for the government to sort of intervene and revoke patents in public interest, and that too without compensation, which in effect means that there is some kind of forfeiture. Then finally, on the question of remedies, patent remedies granted in India are usually very, very strong, but the judicial regime is quite ambivalent because of high amount of judicial discretion in cases where there are real concerns of access or real concerns of public interest. The court may simply not choose to look into it, but choose to look into public interest and other factors in the context of lifestyle drugs. So, because of judicial discretion, the way in which the remedies regime is structured, is not always very coherent. Finally, on the question of test data, India's position has historically been that it is in compliance with the TRIPS agreement, since India's regime is based on permissive reliance and there is no scope for data exclusivity. And this has been one of the major demands of the patent holders, the IP holders, the originators of the drug, who say that India must do a little more with reference to providing test data protection through data exclusivity. And as we shall see, in the context of RCEP, this was specifically proposed and rejected, and it does not appear in the final text of RCEP. So, another important question in relation to the pharma ecosystem is the increasing technological complexity, particularly in vaccines and biologics, where even if you have a kind of lax patent regime, etc., technology transfer holds the key. And we saw this in the recent context of COVID-19, where irrespective of the fact that some of the patents may have been open, or companies had mentioned that they would not sue for patent infringement of in relation to COVID-19 vaccines, and yet through reverse engineering it's very difficult to actually make mRNA vaccines in the short time frame in which we need, which means global collaboration and technology transfer holds the key in areas where the technology is really complex. And similar is the situation in relation to biotech ecosystem in India, and we shall see this from a case study of Monsanto and how the Indian IP and regulatory ecosystem works in relation to innovators vis-a-vis competitors. Now, BT cotton is a very interesting technology because Bacillus thuringiensis is a naturally occurring bacterium in the soil, wherein Monsanto took out its gene sequences that had some toxic properties and introduced them in the plant cell. Now, this technology is able to protect the ball of the cotton against what is called as pink bollworm, and this leads to saving the harvest, the saving the yield for farmers, and thus the increase in the yield that occurs by lack of pest attacks is a valuable what you call addition for the farming community in India and all over the world. Now, Monsanto licensed its BT technology to around 50 companies in India, and this happened between the period of 2000 and 2015, until in 2015 the government started imposing price controls and royalty caps on Monsanto's ability to receive royalties from on their technology from seed companies, from the hybrid seed companies. Furthermore, Monsanto had collaborated with a local player, that is Myco, and they had entered into a joint venture through which this licensing regime had largely operated in India. But in 2015, again, there was a challenge to their patents, and what it led to was an interpretation of Section 3J of the Indian Patents Act, where the judiciary has sought to narrow down the scope of patents on transgenic inventions, and the judiciary said that the plant variety regime would be the right place to protect such inventions. Of course, this went up in appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has ordered a retrial. But in March 2021, both the parties settled out of court, and hence we do not have a final verdict in terms of clarity on what is the real scope for transgenic inventions in India. Furthermore, the government of India issued a show cause notice to Monsanto uh, under Section 66 of the Indian Patents Act, primarily asking them why their patent should not be revoked because the technology had developed resistance, and hence it was not fulfilling the promise. So, some promise doctrine style reasoning, which Canadian patent system has used for long until it was rejected by their Supreme Court, is being sought to be used in India. Finally, there is also another set of investigations that are pending at the Competition Commission of India for Monsanto having charged unfair and discriminatory royalty conditions, because the argument is that whatever Monsanto charged from the hybrid seed companies was not in relation to the value of the technology, and that there was some kind of exploitative conduct. Now, in such a situation where Monsanto's patents, were revoked, and then the fiasco around its validity of its patents, then the government's, interest in trying to revoke those patents. Of course, they did not revoke them. Price controls being imposed, where Monsanto's royalties were slashed by 40%, by 70%, and Competition Commission investigations into unfair and discriminatory licensing conditions led to withdrawal of HTBT, that is the next generation of technology, by Monsanto from India. So, which means basically that all these seed companies who have earlier enjoying a license, a voluntary license, do not have access to next generation of HTBT. What this has led to is a proliferation of smuggled and illegal seeds into India, where the Indian regime has not even approved the technology and the farmers have already started sowing them. In such a situation, realizing that there is a very great demand for HTBT and next generation of cotton seeds, um, company Rallis, which is a subsidiary of Tata, has decided to produce HTBT as a competitive or potentially infringing entry, but there is no clarity on clinical trials with reference to BT in India, because the central government has leaved it to the state to allow clinical trials, and most states are in a very ambivalent position with reference to whether they should allow clinical trials or not, due to new opposition to genetically modified crops. Now, this in this background, in relation to pharma and biotech, it makes sense to ask a very pertinent question. Now, is this strategic regulatory autonomy or strategic regulatory ambiguity? The reason being, there is an increasing shift in the pharma biotech sector and towards transgenic agritech, where there is high level of technological complexity. In such a situation, technology transfer ecosystem relies more on voluntary technology licensing that includes both patent licensing arrangements and also know-how sharing, and not exclusively on patents alone, which means global collaborations in complex technology is a kind of a situation where it leads to win-win for both the collaborators. Otherwise, there is a complex process of reverse engineering which may take endless time to come out with a competing or a better improving technology. Then there is also a question of loss of exclusivity and incentives for collaborators by local companies if a sound patent regime does not work in favor of the innovators and the originators of the technology. Furthermore, in relation to both pharma and agri-biotech, there are increasing concerns that there may be local innovation and value creation. And in such a situation, if the regulatory and the IP regime is lax, then what could be its consequences on local innovation and value creation? So, in spite of the fact that India has exercised strategic regulatory autonomy, there are certain limits to TRIPS flexibilities and the pluralism that the TRIPS agreement provides. And this we have seen in the latest context of vaccine tech transfer, particularly in relation to mRNA, where without the access to that particular technology through collaboration, it's very difficult to reverse engineer. Of course, you would come out with a competing version in the future, but there is a need for effective collaboration. And the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that except mRNA, in various other vaccines, there has been very high level of collaboration and open licensing policies being followed by originator companies and in between the vaccine manufacturing companies. Similarly, Monsanto's withdrawal of its next generation of HTBT technology from India has very important lessons for tech transfer, local innovation, and tech access, because in some sense, by imposing constraints on the ability of innovative companies, it has led to a situation where Indian seed companies are starving for access to new and latest technology. Now, all these concerns may erupt in the context of India's FTAs, but it has not so happened in the past. Although some of the major agreements in the region, when I have identified five, have certain IPR related provisions, not any of them have direct implications with reference to the issues that we have discussed to imports and some kind of regulatory constraints on the ability of countries or the parties to have the IP protection. So in these FTAs that India has already had, it is quite clear that IP has been regarded as an investment, and there are measures against expropriation. There is a general consistency, TRIPS consistency, obligation, and also a provision that talks about non-derogation from the TRIPS agreement. There are also exemptions from the expropriation provisions, wherein the measures that you have taken for TRIPS consistency or in relation to essential security interests, particularly in the context of compulsory licenses, revocation, and limitations, or creation of IPRs where they are consistent, shown to be consistent with the TRIPS agreement. Then there are certain anti-performance requirements in relation to tech transfer, wherein forced technology transfer is in some way limited, except in case of a competition remedy or where it is shown that it was TRIPS consistent. And finally, it is important that in one of the FTAs, that is in relation to Japan, there is a very interesting provision on subject matter, on limitations on subject matter exclusion. This has not happened in any of the other FTAs, wherein a direct provision that limits the ability of parties to reject software patents, has been included, wherein this is a very unique provision because it doesn't figure in most other FTAs that India has signed. Now, in this background, it was essential to note that when RCEP was being negotiated, there was huge opposition by India to certain proposals made by Australia, and by Australia to certain proposals made by Japan, Korea, etc. So, for example, in relation to patents, Australia opposed narrowing down of the scope of biotech by subjecting it to TRIPS amendment of Article 27.3. Similarly, it is very interesting to note that when Japan and Korea proposed both patent term restoration and 5 year of data exclusivity, Australia had opposed it. Australia has also opposed the expansion of limited exceptions, which India has proposed for the purposes of experimental use or experimental purposes, primarily because India had argued that such experimental purposes can include research. And Australia thought that that was a very expansive notion of what experimental purposes are. So, as we know, the RCEP negotiations finally, when it came out, the IP chapter is in that sense weak in relation to pharma and biotech subject matter. And that can be regarded as India's negotiating success, although India did not finally decide to become the party to RCEP. Finally, what lessons are in store for Australia India FTA and beyond? So, India's strategic autonomy concerns in the pharma biotech, I think, will continue to dominate its opposition to any kind of TRIPS plus or test data standards in patents and in relation to trade secrets and clinical data. So, it's very interesting that Australia's own domestic concerns on TRIPS plus, as reflected in their negotiating position on patent term restoration and data exclusivity would mean that similar kind of TRIPS plus provisions may not be demanded. At most, India may kind of agree to RCEP based text because RCEP IP chapter is weak in relation to pharma and biotech. And finally, very little may actually emerge out of these Australia-India FTA negotiations on the real issues that affect the pharma biotech sector in India and in Australia. So, with this, I conclude. We'll be happy to have questions. Thank you.